Well, thank you. So we've heard a lot this afternoon about forest fires, obviously, about the role of climate change and practices, better practices, this kind of thing. What the heck's that got to do with video games, you might say? Well, I guess this is the fun part. I'll get to that bit in a minute, if you bear with me. But what we really want to do is sort of look at this problem from a slightly different angle. And so I'm going to argue today that maybe forest fires are actually really at root a social problem. And so what do I mean by that? Basically that public opinions can sometimes get in the way of best practices. And at the end of the day, maybe it's not so much about the science or even the practices and the policies, but it's about perception. So I want to explore that a little bit and tell you a quick story. I was at a conference in the interior a few years ago. There was various presentations on wildfires. And I had a chance to chat with the then chief forester. And I asked him, I said that, we've heard about prescribed burning. We sort of know how to manage the forest. Why aren't we doing it a lot more? And he said, well, to be honest, we don't do it. The public doesn't like to see smoke in the forest. They get upset if we start taking out trees in their view sheds and their watersheds close to where they live. It's just too unpopular. It's too big a risk for us. We'd like to do it more. So if this is true, and if this is still true in some places, then how do we turn that around? Well, we've heard about education. That's very important. But the research tells us that information, knowledge by itself doesn't actually change things very much. People don't necessarily get motivated. What the psychologists will tell us on the social side is that we need to reach out to both hearts as well as minds. So one way we could do that is by having a crisis. So scenes like this from Kelowna, where we had in 2003, I think it was 33,000 people were evacuated of devastating fire. It was only after the fire that people in the community started asking for the foresters to come in and start managing the forest. Bruce can probably bear me out on whether how that actually rolled out. But really, do we have to wait for the tragedy? Do we have to wait for all this devastation before we change our minds? Or is there a way to get out in front of the inferno, get out and be proactive and change sort of people's social norms and attitudes to forestry, to fire management, whatever it is? Now, as John said, I'm a landscape architect, landscape planner, as well as a forester or in forestry. And in the design professions, landscape architecture, things like that, we use a lot of these kinds of things, right? We call them artists, used to call them artist renderings, 3D visualizations, and they're just standard routine ways of showing people future ideas, a new project, new design. I hope you guys can recognize this. Everybody know where this is? It's a very green wood building. It's one of the greenest in the world. It's all wood. It's not in a fire zone, Bruce. And this is where CALP, our research group, has. That's actually, I think, supposed to be me standing there. But that's what this was a rendering of a building. And we started thinking around the time of the Kelowna fire in our research group, well, look, there are all these tools and techniques, right? They're being used in a certain way. What if we applied them not to a project or a new garden design or something, but to a whole community, a whole landscape? And what if we sort of rolled out the impacts of climate change on this landscape in a way that people have never seen before? Essentially give them the gift of time travel. How many people have actually seen a community, their own community, in the future? How many of you have actually seen your own future, if you like? It hasn't happened, doesn't happen, right? So how might we do that? Well, we got a chance to try this in a little town called Kimberley. Laurie, you mentioned it, but you failed to mention the most important thing about Kimberley, which is it's the Bavarian capital of British Columbia. Right. Now, you all knew that, right? You all knew that. How many people have been to Kimberley? Oh, quite a few of you, okay. It's a lovely place, right? Did it look like Bavaria to you? Maybe, maybe not. But it's a nice place. It's got a ski hill, it's got a river running through it, it's got a nature park, some nice buildings, and it's nestled in the forest. And that meets our definition, John described it earlier, of what we think an urban forest is. It's where people and forest are in close combination, and the forest influences the community influences the forest. That's our definition in our new urban forestry program. So we were invited in to work with the community of Kimberley and Columbia Basin Trust to help them with a sort of visioning process, to go out into the future and sort of map out some of these alternative scenarios with climate change. And we started that process by building some 3D models so we could layer some of this existing information. We had a pretty limited budget, so we're using things like Google Earth and simple models. And we knew we were getting close to people's hearts and minds when the mayor took one look at this. We were working with council and local stakeholders. The mayor took a look at this and said, oh no, this is not going to work. This isn't Kimberley. This doesn't look like Kimberley. You've got to give the buildings peaked roofs at the very least, right? Apparently, Bavarians don't like flat roofs or something. So we did. You'll see that in a second. But we assembled this package of information, maps, models, Google Earth. People could fly around their own community in an open house. And we invited in the residents and the citizens to sort of be part of this process. And they saw things like this. So there are the peaked roofs of the homes, some of them, the center of town. I guess I have a little pointer I could be using, if you can see that. And then all these funny colors that are kind of draped over the hillsides back there. That's actually some mapping, some modeling in GIS, Geographic Information Systems, of susceptibility to mountain pine beetle. This was back in 2009 about, and it was before the beetle had actually got to Kimberley. And so this mapping, the orange and the yellow, represent those pine-dominated stands where the forest fire, where the mountain pine beetle was going to be more likely, and also where fire risk might increase from the dead trees. And so this was really the first time the community had seen a projection, a future projection of how their community was going to be affected by a kind of a known threat, in this case, pine beetle. How big it was. It's a tourist town around the ski hill, this kind of thing. And they could also see that there were, if you can see this here, sort of this whole watershed, which drains down into the river, comes through the middle of town, would be, pretty damaged by a lot of dead trees, a lot of more intense rainstorms. We're going to get flooding. And in fact, in some of these areas, the engineers had already identified some of the hazard zones along the stream, along Mark Creek there, right through the middle of town, where homes were likely to get flooded, damaged, destroyed by floods, debris jams, things like that. So as part of the process, just good old landscape architectural tools, get out some markers and work on some 3D graphics. And you'll see there, what this is a proposal for opening up this creek where it comes through this bendy bit where the hazards were, open it up, naturalize the stream corridor, and reduce the risk to the buildings. That was one of the proposals. But I think perhaps the most dramatic moment when we did this workshop, was when we visualized a future forest fire in the area of Kimberley. So here's the main town of Kimberley. We're also using Google Earth here. And here's a fire ignition point, a random fire ignition point. This came from some modeling by Bob Gray of fire spread. And we were able to show the community, what might happen with that kind of fire. In 4 hours, that fire reaches the main exit from the community. In another 4 hours, it burns through the town and cuts off the only other exit from Kimberley. So if you are a Kimberley resident and you get a fire with a prevailing wind like this, you could have, at best, 8 hours to evacuate with all your favorite belongings. And of course, the fire could be much larger than that. When we showed that little sequence right there, there was a gasp in the entire room. They had never seen this in material before, although it was public information, had been available before. And we'd effectively put them out in front of the Inferno. They were out in a projected future where they could see the threat coming. And they were sort of obviously motivated to start thinking about fire smart in a much more serious kind of way. we'd sort of touch them, we'd hit their emotional button, and they were now highly motivated. So since that time, Kimberley has done actually a number of things around this adaptation plan that this visioning process was part of. So here, for example, this is in the nature park, a before and after, of how they've cleared out the kind of techniques that Bruce and Laurie and Lyle have been talking about to create this park-like structure in a park. What could be more appropriate? They've also started actually reconstructing the creek as per some of those plans, opening it up, naturalizing it. It's not complete there, but they've already made a big difference. So what this tells us is that communities can learn to adapt to these risks, forest fire and climate change. But unfortunately, that's not the only problem. There's a bigger problem that we still have to solve if we're worried about things like forest fires and other climate change impacts. And that is that if we keep going on our present path, then these are the official projections for different scenarios in British Columbia. We could be looking at a 4, 6, 8 degrees increase in warming in British Columbia. Okay? Those are the projections, and this is our sort of current high carbon pathway. Well, what does that mean, and how do we get out of that? Really, what we want to do is get down to a lower carbon scenario globally that would reduce these risks, because if all we do is adapt, we're going to have more and more expense, more difficulty in meeting our adaptation targets as the climate change problem gets worse. We have to fix climate change at root, not just through adaptation. We have to mitigate it. And that is where social barriers come in again, because what that means is we've got to modify the things that we all take for granted and we love and we desire. Things like lovely big houses. This is in North Vancouver. Lots of cars, the way we commute, our industry, many other things have to be changed. That's going to be extremely difficult. How do we change those social norms to a different pathway that will mean we have fewer forest fires, or we have more controllable impacts? So we started wondering about, can we take the sort of examples like the Kimberley examples and others and sort of expand it hugely? Can we go out and reach, with some of these tools, much larger groups of people and really try and motivate some of these kinds of changes in society using some of these techniques? And we were thinking about youth in particular, because they're the ones going to get affected by these things. And we were thinking about it, and okay, what's the most compelling kind of visualization or visual media, visual processes that might be powerful? And of course, you got it. We thought about video games. What else, right? So here's an existing mechanism where we can capture everybody's attention, just like that. Kids get addicted to this stuff. We know that. They're rich, they're compelling, they're exploring new worlds, they're facing challenges. Is it going to be possible to adapt that commercial style video game to something that has a social conscience, that teaches them about climate change and that motivates them to do something about it? That was the kind of the question. So we took that idea to the school district in Delta. So as you know, Delta is a low-lying community of farmland and small towns on the Fraser floodplain. It's vulnerable to sea level rise and other climate change impacts. We'd done some previous work with scenarios. We'd looked at different kinds of adaptation strategies. We'd virtually breached the dikes and flooded the community to see how it would turn out. We had a lot of information to work with. And we'd also done sort of a prototype with a video game in this area that was suggesting it was possible. So we went to the district, and they kind of bought into the idea, somewhat to our amazement. You want to try this? They said, you can go and talk to the students and the teachers, but with one caveat: no blood. Right? No dead bodies floating around in Delta, okay? Anything else, you go for it, but we don't want any violence. So, okay, we can deal with that. And we got this incredible reaction. We had 30 volunteer students from many different schools coming up to UBC to help us co-design this game. we're not the experts, right? I'm an old guy. So, we need the kids to tell us what's really cool and what's engaging. And they did. They came out in droves. The teachers were really supportive. And we created, together with them, a game called Future Delta 2.0. And after about a year and a half of work, we were able to test that in schools, 2 different classes in 2 schools and about 150 kids. And these were not the kids that co-designed. These were kids who were a captive audience. So we didn't really have much choice, actually, once the teacher said yes. So they were a good subject. So what did the game actually look like? What did we build with their help? Well, it's a real place in Delta. We had fictional non-player characters. This is Chuck, who has a renewable energy house. And you meet these players in the community that you know and you recognize. There are various tasks, identifying things in the community that relate to climate change or adaptation, mitigation, that kind of thing. But one of the things the co-designers really told us was, you've got to use the doom and gloom. You've got to go out and grab them right away, suck them in, tell them why it's going to be so bad if you don't do anything. And we said, well, psychology says you don't want to overpower them. No, he said, you've got to throw it at them. So what we did, we said, okay, well, we listened. The game starts in 2100 in a sort of a dystopic future of congestion and traffic and pollution and overcrowding.
But it wasn't until the year of the drought that people began to see how bad things were. Uncontrollable fires raged through Burns Bog and Western Island's bird sanctuary. Local farmers lost acres of crops year after year. Everyone began to ask if this was natural. Then who can forget the floods? At first we noticed the storms.
Okay, this is just a clip from an introduction. So what happens, the player starts out as sort of an old person in 2100. They get transported back to 2015, sort of Back to the Future kind of idea, as a school-age kid in 2015, and they have to change the future. They have to find a new pathway back to 2100 that is better than what they actually ended up with under that scenario. And so this is one example in North Delta. 2015. Ouch. Here comes Carl. He's not happy.
You've got to be kidding me! This stupid tree ruined my Hummer. I hate trees.
Yeah. So, not the greatest not the greatest advert for urban forestry, right? But actually, what I forgot to say was that morning is the first morning in Act 1 where there's been a windstorm, there's been power cuts. That sound familiar? And although we did this a long time ago now. And so it raised the conversation about, the importance of having a healthy tree canopy, of the risks to trees from climate change, and some of the trade-offs around those kinds of things. So there's a whole series of those, and you'll be able to see a few examples outside later because we've got some demos in the atrium. But essentially, you work your way through 3 acts, 3 different communities, out towards 2035, when you start to see some of these future scenarios. This one happens to be a managed retreat scenario in a flood-prone community where they basically pulled back from the most vulnerable areas. That's an adaptation type of strategy. Or you could do adaptation and mitigation, where you have a resilient floating community that's powered by renewable energy. And so these are the kind of outcomes. So what did the students think of all this? Well, I'll show you a brief clip that talks about one of the kinds of tools that the students enjoyed, and also hear from one of the teachers.
It has tools like carbon vision, which lets the players see what objects around them have a high carbon footprint.
Right now we just tagged a Hummer that had a lot of carbon in it, and we changed it into a Tesla, which didn't have as much.
The kids getting more engaged, and I think they ask questions and just show interest in things, and that's the game really helps in that.
So the teachers were very pleased that the students were really engaged in the classes. It was over several different classes, several weeks. And we could clearly see the kids were enjoying themselves and that they were they were telling us, what was really cool. They told us what sucked and how you could improve the design. It's not perfect, it's a prototype. But it was clear that they learned, and they were all adamant that this was way better than learning about climate change in a textbook. And so we tested them. We determined that they did sort of come to understand some abstract concepts like mitigation. They got 82% of this particular class identified appropriately some viable options for mitigation in their community. And over half the students told us that having played the game, it made them think differently about climate change. So you think about that, there's like 80 students in Delta walking around who see their community a little differently now. So it seems like these, obviously a compelling video game, a place-based video game like this can change people's minds, can make them think very differently and engage with the problem. But also the sort of the low-tech techniques, as we showed in Kimberley, can also be pretty effective. So what does this really mean? What are the implications for this? Essentially, we're going to need more of these cool tools in use. We're going to have to rethink how we do community engagement to really sort of help people understand and be motivated to act. It means that we should be able to improve training for professionals and practitioners so they can use some of these techniques, support the teachers in the education so they can do these kinds of things, improve the tools. And we're one example here with our students. We need to make sure that when they graduate from the urban forestry program, they come out not only with good biology skills and ecology and management skills, but they have good people skills. So they can actually engage with communities effectively. They can overcome social barriers to sustainability problems or best practices that sometimes they get in the way. And that they can actually protect the forests and the communities against climate change that we love, and essentially have some fun while they're doing it. Anyway, thank you very much.